I would love, and it's okay if this doesn't come off the top of your head, but if there's like a self-care scam that you've seen recently, or it doesn't even have to be like a scam. It doesn't have to be like as devious as like these people are scamming me, but like maybe just something that's kind of bullshitty. Is there something you've seen lately that like just you're like, oh my God?
Well, I'm 41, and so I'm in that like perimenopause space. So
Yeah.
basically my entire algorithm is full of menopause, perimenopause stuff, and it's like all the things, whether it's like the hormones or the
Hmm.
eat protein. Like I feel like we're supposed to be eating like something like insane, like 50 grams of protein like every morning or something. I don't
Like
even
I'm
know like what's
only
actually
supposed to be eating chicken and cottage cheese. Those are the only things
basically
I'm supposed to put into my body. Yes.
basically. And all of that stuff. And I know there's been a lot written about that recently. It's like whenever the media and then whenever like the tech industry gets a hold of a white space, it's
Hmm.
like it just gets so crowded so immediately. It feels a little bit like the motherhood space felt maybe like 6 or 7 years ago,
Mm.
where all of a sudden it was sort of like, oh yeah, being a mom is hard. And then there was just like everything was all about supporting moms, which is great. Like, I'm a perinatal psychiatrist. Like, that's my whole clinical practice. I am a mom. Like, it's good. I'm not saying like that we don't need that. It's just so interesting to watch how these cycles go.
Yeah.
And I think it does track with sort of like our generation
Yeah.
of, sort of geriatric millennial, maybe like young Gen X, where we have sort of decided that whatever we're going through, we're going to make it the thing.
Yeah, we are the center of the story, no matter
Yes. We are the main characters.
what. This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
And I am Dr. Pooja Lakshmin. I am a board certified psychiatrist and the author of the book and newsletter, Real Self Care: Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included.
I also think that if you even track, like, oh, if we had motherhood at the center, like motherhood is hard at the center of the story 6, 7 years ago, now those moms are entering into the perimenopausal space and are like, why do I feel bad? Right. And like, there are
Yes.
all these systemic reasons why we feel bad. But then there's also the like, oh, but we can explain it through like the fact that we're going through this period of health. And it's also something that has been largely under discussed.
Yes, yes. And, like that was the whole reason with my book, Real Self Care, and like sort of the tongue in cheek subtitle,
Yeah.
Crystals, Cleanses, and Bubble Baths Not Included, which I had to fight hard to like get my publisher to be okay with having
Really?
that.
I
Well,
always
because it was
think that
just
they would
so
love
long.
that. Oh, yeah. It's very much an academic title. Like, or like the length of it is
The
like,
length, yes. They were like, well,
yeah.
I don't know if it's gonna fit on the cover. And anyway, but right, like this isn't just you can't meditate your way out of a 40-hour work week with no childcare. Like that's not how real wellness works. And when we still don't have federally mandated paid parental leave, when we're seeing like the erosion of women's reproductive health, the list goes on and on. But it's so easy to get stuck on whether it's hormones or whether it is like whatever sort of easy, simple solution, because that is something that you can like, it's like tangible. It's like
Right.
something that you can immediately sink your teeth into and be like, okay, well, I'm going to change my diet or I'm going to go do this
Yep.
exercise. And you can cross it off the list and you can feel like you have a sense of control and agency, which again, like it's very human to want that. Like we live in this completely chaotic, fucked up world. Like, of course, we're trying to grasp for ways to make ourselves feel a sense of mastery. But as we'll talk about today with real self-care, it's really about like finding the balance and the nuance and not going to the extremes.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people who would never consider themselves like obsessed with optimization have still negotiated adulthood against a backdrop of obsession with optimization. So there is this tendency, I think, to be like, oh, I can just find this one hack that will fix perimenopause. If I can just take hormones now, even though my mom couldn't because there was this whole generation of women, and a lot of us had moms who went through the same, like their doctors really strongly recommended against it. Like, if I can just find the doctor who will give me the hormones and none of this will happen to me, like I will fix this problem. Or if I eat 40 grams, however many grams, I don't even know how many grams it is.
No, I don't even
many
know
grams of protein a day and get really into like heavy weightlifting, then I will have none of those problems. And that's, we don't operate in, like our bodies don't operate in vacuums that way.
Exactly. The context is so important. And fortunately or unfortunately, like we are all multifactorial. Like we live in this world with so many different inputs. So sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, but there is evidence for eating more protein and like working on your bone health and, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of like, yeah, it's not that that's bad, right? Like it's good. It's just that when you become obsessed with it and fixated on it, and when you think that's the fantasy thing that's going to fix your whole life, that's when you get into trouble.
Yeah. If I can just do this thing, then all of my problems will be solved.
Yeah. Yep.
And usually like you can't even do that one thing, but it's that grasping towards it.
Yeah.
Today we're going to like talk about practical stuff, philosophical stuff. Like you are the perfect person to grapple with all of this stuff together. And you're also going to stick around to answer like a very straightforward but a fascinating AAA question about how to celebrate personal achievements without alcohol. But let's start with a question from Jacqueline that is a bit of a table setter for us.
I work at a nonprofit as a community advocate. Self-care is a huge buzzword phrase internally at the agency and is also encouraged externally with clients. The more I think about the idea, the more that I think self-care is a privilege, something that people who have the money and time to practice it get to benefit from. I think it is also a learned skill. If practicing wellness or setting boundaries is not demonstrated in someone's life, how would they be able to access the skill and privilege of practicing self-care?
I feel like there's two parts of this question, right? The first is how the concept of self-care has become so integrated into many workplace environments. And I know you speak at a lot of like workplace environments from people who they're like, let's get a speaker on self-care. And I wonder if you're like me, where sometimes like you show up and tell them some things that they don't necessarily want to hear about what self-care actually is. Like just a more complex story than maybe they're anticipating.
Yeah. I mean, the whole crux of real self-care is that this work comes from like Audre Lorde and bell hooks, Black queer thinkers who were talking about self-care as not only self-preservation, but also in the context of a society that is coming after you, is hostile to you. And it was interesting because when I was researching for the book, I also found that while the word self-care was being used in the civil rights movement, it was also, interestingly, shockingly, being used in psychiatry. Also, psychiatrists were using the word self-care to refer to the very small, mundane decisions that patients who were on locked inpatient units could make about their life on the unit. So like what they were going to eat for breakfast, picking out their clothes, what exercise group they were going to attend. So I thought that was so fascinating because here is like, when you think about rights being stripped away or autonomy being stripped away, being hospitalized on a psych unit against your will is pretty much the epitome of that. Yeah. And the word self-care then being used for whatever small choices you could make in that context, I thought was so fascinating because it does track too with the situation that many folks in the civil rights movement and like, frankly, like right now in 2025, we're now in 2025, feel currently, where it's like you have such a limited set of options. So I guess going back to the original kind of question, when I go into kind of corporate America and talk about real self-care, I think, it's interesting because I think people are so burnt out and just kind of like so desperate for something that sometimes I think like the social justice aspect of this work almost like flies over people's heads.
Yes.
And I don't.
But I thought that we could like have a wellness retreat and it would be okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And people really still want to come back to like the yoga or the meditation or like whatever the thing is. And I guess I've learned that, and maybe this is me being a psychiatrist, that it's never helpful to be banging people over the head with something that they can't quite hear yet.
Yeah.
So I kind of try and tuck it into the stories, and also really try and identify when I'm working with, usually it's like a wellness, it's like the ERG, like, or the, like the mental health ERG, or like the folks who are kind of the leaders in the company who are really trying to do this work, and have some more kind of deeper conversations with them. You know, I do think I want to say, like, I think corporate America gets really like demonized a lot, and you know, rightly so, I understand. And like, when I work with organizations, like all of the people that I work with seem like really like good people. Like they want to do the right thing, you know, like they're really wanting to try and make it better.
Yeah. And they're hemmed in by some structural things that make it really difficult.
Yes.
Like I went to speak to a gathering of emergency physicians, and they have just incredible burnout rates, and like fewer people going into the specialty because it's a burnout machine, and like the attrition amongst women in particular is like they're dropping the percentage of people within the field significantly over the course of the last 20 years. And there are people who are trying so hard to think about these solutions, and sometimes it's like, well, how do we address these twin forces of private equity buying up our practices, and also just the way that we've set up emergency medicine as a field? What if we have to reorganize that entirely? Like, that is huge, big work. But how can we start to think about that as a possibility? Like, how do you do that at a conference?
Yeah,
You
right.
know?
Like it's not right. It has to be really an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
And you do need those big events to sort of like get people's morale up and to feel like progress is being made. But it also needs to be happening really like on a week by week, month by month basis. I've come to believe or see that the organizations that are small or medium sized tend to have an advantage because they can be more agile, and they're more responsive to their employees, and people feel like they have a voice. But when the organizations get to be like super, super big, then it's a lot harder to make some of these changes.
What do you think about the second part of this question about how practicing boundaries and other parts of self-care is something that like you need time, you need the privilege of time to practice, or the privilege of like other people modeling it for you? Because I think sometimes people are like, well, rich people can have self-care because they can go on vacations, but this is a different thing. I think this is about like the privilege of time and practice and models.
Yes. It might be un-PC to say, but I know plenty of rich people that are absolutely miserable and have terrible boundaries.
100%. Yes.
But I love this question because it's something that I actually think about and grapple with all the time of, is real self-care a privilege? Or is it a skill, or is it both? And I think it is both, because real self-care, like the 4 skills, the 4 principles: boundaries, compassion, values, and power. Those are psychological concepts that if you had a healthy childhood and you were raised by parents who were generally healthy psychologically and physically, and you had enough resources, and you were generally, you know, I'm using a lot of like kind of generalizations here, but like if you generally like were growing up in a regulated environment, you would have learned some of those skills.
Yep.
And that is a privilege, because that does give you a leg up in life. It's basically like you had Psych 101 growing up.
Yeah.
But many of us were not fortunate enough to be born into a family like that. And plus or minus whether, you know, there was money or other types of resources, you could still grow up in a family environment where emotionally and psychologically it was quite impoverished, but there might have been access to other resources. However, if you did not learn these skills, then you will not be able to make use of those other external resources in a way that is actually generative.
Yeah.
The good news is that what I've been doing with my patients for, I guess, probably a decade, more than a decade now, in therapy, it works. Like change is possible. And essentially what real self-care is like you're learning these set of principles. You're learning to build these new muscles where you learn how to tolerate guilt, where you learn how to regulate your emotions, where you learn that you can make decisions on behalf of your own well-being, even when people are annoyed with you or pissed at you. And you can move forward with a deeper understanding of what you really want in your life. The thing is that it takes time.
Yeah.
And it takes practice, and it takes messing up a zillion times and coming back. You know, it's interesting, Anne, how you like started off by asking, like you said, is the time the privilege piece of it? And I think that is the second privilege piece of it. So the first privilege is like if you were born into a family where you already got a head start.
Right.
The second is if you, because of the way that your life is set up, you have the time to dedicate to whether it's going to therapy, whether it is working through your own research and through your own reading and like working on these different habits. For myself, I will say like I didn't have children until I was later in life. So I had my son when I was 38 and a half. And so basically I had my whole 30s essentially to go to therapy for a whole decade. I was in psychoanalysis, which was like 3 times a week. And I was a doctor. Like I had the financial resources too, to be able to, and I also had good insurance that helped me pay for it. So I took that time, but there are plenty of people in my life who were like, Pooja, like you're totally wasting your time and you're wasting your money. You should be saving that money. Like that should be in your 401k, right? Like why are you spending all this time doing this? And I felt like, no, like this is actually really important for me to sort out what I want in my life, especially since I had been through like a traumatic 20s and a divorce and all sorts of life stuff. But a lot of, I think especially for women and like women that I see in my practice, like that idea that like you're allowed to take a risk. You're allowed to do something that feels selfish or feels impractical or feels silly just because you want to. You want to see where it goes. I think there's something about that, like having that boldness that enables people, like if you're able to give that to yourself, then you can kind of get yourself on this trajectory to finding the time.
Yeah, no, I think too about like working through like issues in my relationship, for example. I feel like I have a tremendous privilege of time in that my partner and I spend a lot of time talking to one another when like an issue comes up. So like if something happens, like we go on like an hour, 2 hour long walk and we'll just talk about it. And that privilege of time allows us to like continually process this and like hear each other and voice things and like go through all sorts of different reactions instead of feeling like, well, there's no time to talk about this right now, or we'll talk about this later. I've never really thought about how like that has allowed this relationship to really feel like no matter what happens, we can work through it because of that privilege of time. And not everyone, you know, if you're working all the time, if you are constantly on demand to provide care for someone else, whether it's a kid or an elder or someone else in your family, like there are just so many reasons that make it difficult to have that sort of time. And it makes sense that like no one would think of like time to argue with your partner as like a form of self-care, but I think it is.
Yeah, because it's you're allowing yourself the space for the repair.
Yeah.
I think like there's a way that we have, you know, because caregiving in America is so difficult because of the lack of support that we have, we've kind of like done away with the space for being able to grapple in our relationships. And that's like intimate relationships with partners and also even friendships. Like the number of patients that I have that are like literally like I don't have any close friends because I don't have time. I spend all my time either working, dealing with kids or parents that I'm taking care of, and then I'm just dead tired. And like we've sort of constructed that as like that's normal.
Yeah, I mean, I encounter this all the time, especially with the research on my new book. Is like,
yes,
I had friends, but now I only text with them. And like the idea of going on a walk with someone or a dinner date or just going to hang out and fold laundry together, that is also a form of self-care.
Yes.
Also, because of the way self-care has been set up in this commodified fashion, it doesn't figure in as much.
Yes.
I want to go to our next question now, which is about some of this branding that we see around different modes of self-care. This is from Natalie.
Why are we seeing typical or common sense approaches in areas like personal hygiene, careers, friendships become codified with pithy names in the recent social landscape? Where do things like quiet quitting and skin cycling converge? And why does it feel like Gen Z is always at the forefront of this, needing scripts or labels for things?
I mean, the one I would add to like the example that comes to my mind is what is it? This total shower? Melody, is that right? Do you know about this?
A full body shower?
No.
No, it's like there's like a name.
Oh, everything shower.
The everything shower.
Yeah.
Which
Is that when you
takes
wash your hair too?
It's when you wash your hair and your body and you shave your legs.
Oh, okay.
Whereas just doing like one of any of those things.
Got it.
Which, like, I understand. I mean, I used to, when I was a teenager, I did an everything shower every single day, but that's because, like,
What a time.
I was so bored. I had nothing else to do but like shave my legs every day. But I would also say that I don't think Gen Z is any more inclined to come up with names for things. Oftentimes with something like quiet quitting, like an editor at a magazine who wants to write a piece will see one TikTok where someone calls it that and then be like, all of Gen Z is talking about quiet quitting. And it's like, there were like 10 TikToks total about this. Like, you're making a trend out of something that is more like, I think, often a feeling, right? So like quiet quitting is not hustling all the time, right? Or like not feeling like you have to go above and beyond, and instead like treating your job like a job, which is not a new sentiment, right? It's just now we are trying to grapple with how a new generation is confronting that sentiment.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can see this on both sides, and on one hand, like, I think our media environment, and you know this better than I do, but like just the way that it has become so cannibalized, and how everything is like so noisy. There's just so much stimulation coming in. So it's like you need to have a specific name for something to break through. Like,
Yeah.
I think to your point of that some of this is editors knowing that when you have something catchy that is a few syllables, then people will glom onto it. And it's a way for it to actually get attention and traction. That's human nature. Like, when we have a name for something, then we know how to talk about it. We know how to connect with other people around it. I think there's something to, like, this feels a little bit adjacent to just how deeply personal and popular memes can be. And sharing memes, and how sharing memes has become its own form of like a version of friendship. Like, you're basically sharing a feeling back and forth. It's like, you get this feeling, and then you put it out there, and then your friend gets the same feeling, and you're both just like, oh my gosh, like, you know, and you have a little chuckle. It's that same sort of thing, I think, with these phrases. And so I think I also feel, you know, empathetic and compassionate for Gen Z. I feel like they get dumped on so much, but like they're growing up in this like media hellscape. And so they have done what they need to do to like survive. And part of that is to parse things down and name things in this way. And it's bleak out there in terms of, you know, their financial prospects and their job prospects, and like all of these institutions that people in our generation, at least for an early part of our lives, I think we still sort of believed in and held on a pedestal. I don't think the same is true now, but Gen Z, like, they grew up with this feeling of like, well, I don't know, you know, I guess we'll figure it out. And so I think partly it's artificial and partly it's like survival.
Yeah. I think your reaction is so right that, like, if we can look at it with curiosity instead of condemnation, like, what is the use of this? So how does this feel useful to people who are doing this? And also understand that it's not the entire generation. It's like some people who are doing it.
Yes. And it can be super niche. And I think it also gives the people who are using these terms, like, in its own way, it like gives them a sense of community because,
Yeah.
you know, so much of Gen Z is like organized around the internet and what spaces they hang out on the internet and who they hang out with on the internet. And, you know, and we know the ways in which that becomes like weaponized and dangerous, but also some of it is actual real connection and community. I will say one other thing about this is, you know, as I've been kind of doing more on media and like growing into my new identity as an author and kind of all these things, as I've spoken with different consultants or advisors and things like that, what people will tell you is that you're supposed to like create new words.
Totally.
Like, you're supposed to like make up these new things and like say it's a thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
I find that funny too, because it's like it works to some extent. And you have these people who are also like trying to make certain things happen, trying to make fetch happen. You know,
Yes.
it's like that doesn't always happen. When it does actually happen, that means it's really hit a nerve and it's actually hit a feeling. It's hit a feeling.
Yes, totally. Okay, our next question is from Madeline, and it's about a specific corner of self-care. I'm so excited for this one.
I am super interested in the overlap between self-care and embracing hobbies, often touted as a way to improve mood and mental health. I feel like so many of my peers, millennial women, are embracing it. It can also feel a bit performative when people share about it on social media. Have you noticed this? What's up with that? Is this a new thing related to social media, or has this always been the case?
Okay, I have theories about this, but I want to hear from you first.
So I'll tell a story. The first time that I went to therapy, I was a medical student, and my like chief complaint, quote unquote, when I went to see the therapist was that I didn't know what to do if I wasn't studying.
Yes.
And I needed to get hobbies, and I did not know how to have hobbies. And granted, like I could have had many other chief complaints, like the fact that I was like having panic attacks when I drove over a bridge, or like there was many other things that were definitely more pressing. But
like,
this was the thing.
Hobby.
I need hobbies. I'm now 41 and I still am terrible at hobbies. I guess I would say two things. I don't think this is new. I don't think this is new. I think we're just like it's being broadcast more now because of social media. I think like with all of real self-care, like the best stuff lies in the middle and you get in trouble when you fall to the extremes. So I'm on the one extreme, which is that I'm a workaholic and it's really hard for me to have hobbies because whenever I get a hobby, I try to turn it into work.
Yep.
And now my entire career is something that was essentially a hobby, but now it's my job.
Yep.
And that is its own interesting place to live. Then you have the other opposite extreme, which is the person who sticks with the hobbies and really enjoys the hobbies, but also like becomes very, very intense about them and is almost like a zealot
Yep.
about said hobbies. Like they're not monetizing them or like making them their career or things like that. But like whether they're in CrossFit or whether they're a vegan or whatever the thing is, that's like becomes their whole identity. Some of the most like well-adjusted people that I know are people that have hobbies and they are like quiet about them. Like they don't broadcast them. They enjoy gardening. They like to cook, and it's just like something that they do for themselves, and they're enjoy doing it, and it's not something that has to be done loudly. So hobbies aren't bad. Hobbies aren't bad. Like hobbies are good. It's good to have hobbies, but it's all like the whole thing with real self-care is that it's like none of these things are bad. It's just that you need to work through the principles of the boundaries, the compassion, the values, the power to understand what is bringing you to the thing, to make sure that you have the right reasons. And then you'll be able to have the hobby be something that's just generative and not something that you need to showcase.
Performative like that.
Performative. Yeah. Exactly.
I think that a lot of people have gone through burnout or experienced burnout or are continuing to experience burnout over the last 10 years and have understood, like, okay, I reached a breaking point. Something in my life needs to change. And that also, for many, but not all, that corresponds with maybe having a little bit more stability, both in their jobs and in their income, in order to spend more time and resources on a hobby. And also like their kids getting a little bit older so that there's a little bit more time to allocate to that. And that also intersects with, especially for parents, like this place where you're like, who am I? Who am I apart from being a parent? Like, I want to rediscover some of those components. And if it's also not what I do for pay, like it's not my job, who am I? And how do you discover that? Other things in your life. And we are at a point where fewer and fewer people in their 30s and 40s are involved in religious communities. So it's not, I am a Christian, I am a Muslim. Like, that's still true for some people, but it's not necessarily the case. So where do you find that source of identity, or like that's that wellspring of like, who am I? What do I actually like to do? A hobby. But marathon running only has so much space for you, right? Like, there is only so much like intensity and like identity formation that can be gleaned from that, or from gardening, or from knitting, or whatever the thing is. And so you have to expand it. You have to make it like, I'm not just running a marathon, I am super involved in the marathon community.
Yeah.
Or I'm not just like growing a couple herbs on my windowsill, I am growing 1,000 dahlias, like me. And then there's also that need, that incredible compulsive need, which true, I think, especially of millennials, but other generations as well, that are raised in similar time span, to like, okay, if I'm doing something, I have to be the best at it. Like, I need to make it a really prominent line on my resume. And then you funnel all of this energy. And the way that you justify that you are spending so much time on it is you have to like broadcast it and like how amazing it is, right? If you are just mediocre and you never post it on Instagram, like, how is it worth all of this time that you're dedicating to it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, I think that is ridiculous, but at the same time, this is how my brain works, and this is how a lot of my people I know, this is how their brains work, is like, how do I justify this thing that seems so selfish, when really what it is like exploring things that you actually like to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does any of that make sense? Is there anything that you want to push back against there?
No, I think that's right. I think like pinpointing how it's filling an identity need. And if it needs to fill an identity need, then it has to take up a lot of space, and it has to be seen, because our identities are formed in connection with other humans. So therefore it has to be performed. Whereas the healthier definition of a hobby should be more related to there's this phrase that is used a lot in India and maybe in other parts of Asia, time pass. So just a way to pass the time.
Yeah.
Right. You know, just something to do that feels good, that's fun, that's not scrolling your phone. And so whether that is pickleball, or whether that is going for a walk, or like trying a new recipe, or right, like it's like you're holding it more lightly.
Yeah.
The people that I've seen that are the best at this are people that are not looking for external validation, and have multiple small hobbies. Like, it's not just like one hobby that takes up everything. It's like they have 3 or 4 things that they enjoy. Admittedly, I'm not one of those people, but I think it also maybe correlates to just like the commodification of time too, and just how we have all become, because we live in the society that we live in, we feel like we need to justify how we're spending our time, and so it needs to feel productive, and we need to feel like we're excelling at it, when in fact I think we would all do, it would be good for all of us to do some more things in a more mediocre way, and just let it be that.
Okay, this is a perfect tee up to our next question, which is about people like us. Let's hear from Caroline.
I imagine that many culture studies subscribers are former or recovering perfectionists. Lately, I've seen and heard a lot about this concept of forgiving yourself more, like giving yourself 1,000 breaks and then 1,000 more. What content or guidance is out there on how recovering perfectionists actually do that? How do we actually be kinder to ourselves and rewire that programming?
Yeah, I agree that there are a lot of recovering perfectionists in this subscriber base. And my struggle has always been with like, okay, that advice to like lower the bar and then lower it again. Like, aren't I failing in some way? But who am I failing? The clumps of dog hair on the steps, like, who is that failing? Just trying to think about like actually come up with the person that would be failing. And when I realized that it's absolutely no one, that frees me a little bit. But I would love to hear your advice here.
Yeah. So when I think of perfectionism, I think of it in relation to control. So when you're a perfectionist, you really want to be able to predict and control an uncertain situation and an uncertain life. And so perfectionism is your measuring stick to kind of feel like you have some semblance of agency in any different situation. The problem is that perfectionism limits your ability to genuinely connect with other people because you are too preoccupied in your own mind with the measuring stick. And so you don't have enough space to actually be there in real time and be present and engage and like alive, essentially.
Yeah.
So it ends up being counter to your goals because you're constantly kind of like upping the ante in the control and perfectionism when what we all really want as humans is to feel seen and loved and understood. But if you're in your head with this measuring stick, you're not going to ever feel that way. So it's like basically like a stairway to, you know, just misery. So that's kind of like the context that I think about perfectionism with. And then in terms of like getting better at being mediocre, the way that it's worked for me in the past is that so each time you lower the bar, you're taking a risk, right? Because your inner critic, perfectionistic brain is going to be like, oh my God, but like, what about that hair? What about that dog hair? Right? Like you said, it's just going to like kind of go off. And so you have to take a leap of faith. You have to take a risk and be like, nope, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And so for me, I've had to like literally just like make notes to myself, like kind of keep a little journal. I use the notes app on my phone for a lot of different things where you just kind of like write down different situations and you say like, oh, I took a risk and I only wrote 200 words instead of 500 words in that newsletter, or I sent this out a day late, and then you follow up and you say like, hey, did the world fall apart? Did everybody say they were going to hate me? Like, did anything happen? No, actually, like something good happened the next day that was like tangentially related, and then you make space. Again, coming back to time and space, this you have to be intentional and actually make space for this. Like you actually go back and look at those notes and remind yourself. And the next time you have one of those little panic feelings about letting somebody down or doing something imperfectly, you come back to the note and you kind of review and you're like, oh, no, I've done this before and it's okay. It's going to be fine. It's actually going to be better because I'm going to be more present and attentive, and I'll be able to make better use of opportunities that come up as opposed to like being stuck in my hamster wheel.
Yeah. I love that idea that like you actually have to make the note and you actually have to come back to it, because I think something about perfectionists is we are often self-flagellating and like almost avoid going back to the note and being like, no, disaster didn't happen. Right. Yeah. Like that feels too good to like confirm that it didn't happen. Okay, so final question before the AAA segment is about when self-care takes like a little bit of a dark turn. Let's hear from Natalie again.
How have boundaries and ideas of self-care gravitated towards us really just acting poorly in our personal relationships? A la the recent online discussion around whether you would drive or pick up a friend at the airport. And how is this contributing to further isolation and hyper-individualism in society, especially in younger generations?
Okay, so I think what this question asker is referring to is the idea that, like, my boundary is not driving you to the airport. Like, you know what I mean? Like that, like using words like boundary, therapy speak, which we addressed in an episode a couple of weeks ago, to talk about just not doing things that like are kind of annoying. How do you think about this?
Yeah. So much of what we've been talking about today is finding the middle ground. And we're never going to get where we want to go by living in the extremes. And so I think for sure there are plenty of ways in which therapy speak and things like boundaries have been used or misconstrued to give people the leeway to, cut off friends who they had a minor disagreement with, or to continue to be more solitary and like refuse to leave their couch and just doom scroll on all day. Like, right. We know that's the case. And I guess if we step back, I see it as probably an overcorrection for a society that did not do a good job of allowing young adults and adults in like polite social situations to express their feelings and to express like what they were really thinking or what they were really feeling. And so now we've kind of gone a little bit too far on the other side. You know, one of the examples that I use sometimes when I'm giving talks, when I'm getting to the third principle of real self-care, values, which is like really understanding what's important to you and how you want to show up in the world. And I'll say like, I see this all the time in like groups of women where people will say like, oh, well, where do you want to eat for dinner? And like nobody will give an opinion. And you have to like pull teeth. And then you'll talk to somebody and you know, we'll be at Chinese food or something and they'll be like, yeah, actually, I really hate Chinese food, but I didn't want to say anything, you know, like you feel bad, like actually expressing what you want to eat and what type of food you like.
Right. It's just food. Yeah.
It's just food, let alone like huge decisions like who you want to be your life partner and like what your career is. Like we're like in the situation where you can't even express like what type of food you want to eat and feel so guilty, like you need to appease everybody else that's around you. So like that's the history that we're coming from. And now we have like a younger generation that is sort of like, no, like I'm not gonna go that way. But I think there needs to be a little bit of course correction. That being said, like, you know, I had a patient the other day who she's going to I think it's like a baby shower, an out of town baby shower. And there's a bunch of women in her little town that are driving together. And she said to me, she was like, I'm so proud of myself. I set a boundary because people were asking about carpooling and volunteering. And I guess it's like the shower is like 2 hours away. And she was like, but I just really wanted a 2-hour drive by myself, or I could listen to whatever podcast I wanted to listen to and just be by myself. And I didn't offer to carpool. And like normally I would have. And that was like a huge boundary for her. And she was so proud of herself. And I was like, that's great. Good for you. I guess what I want to say is like, I think it's really easy for us to knock some of these boundary situations on the outside without knowing the personal perspective of the person who's doing the boundary setting and like what their family of origin is like and like what their relationship history is and like what specific personal thing they're working on at that moment. You know, there's for me, like there's plenty of situations that I look back on now and I'm like, yeah, I totally went overboard with boundaries, or vice versa, but you don't really see it unless it's in hindsight, and you kind of have to learn those lessons for yourself, I think.
Yeah, totally. And you have to get into this place where you can look back on it and be like, that felt incredibly necessary in that moment.
Yeah.
And so what, like spending more time thinking about like what feels necessary, not because like someone's like, these are the boundaries that every person should have in their lives, right? Like what matters to you, what feels important to you.
Yeah.
That's hard, I think, for us to accept because I think a lot of times we want to have like these larger societal norms about what you should and shouldn't do and how you should and shouldn't behave. And I think that makes a lot of people unhappy. So accounting for that and how norms do make people unhappy, like that's useful.
Yeah. And giving people the space to wrestle with it. Like it's not going to help anybody. Like if you feel like someone is being antisocial, essentially, in their boundaries, you confronting them is not going to have them be more social.
Right.
Whereas you giving them the space to grapple with whatever they're grappling with, work out whatever they're working out, and then eventually kind of come back and have more space in their life for you. Like that's different, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about the last point about hyper-individualization, though? That is something that I think about. Like people being like, I'm setting a boundary around like hanging out after 6 p.m. And how like we've just created these mechanisms that do facilitate sometimes I do think that social decorum forces us into situations that once we're there for 10 minutes, we're like, yeah, I did want to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think just overall, like we definitely are like the data set proves this. Like we're lonely. Like we are not doing a good job of being with other people. And we've lost, whether it's the pandemic or social media or, you know, it's a lot of different things, the economic environment, we have gotten ourselves into a situation where we are spending too much time alone. And so that's absolutely true. And I think that, again, I always try to avoid coming to a place from shame, because I find that when you shame yourself into trying to do something that you know is good for you, you usually will fall off the wagon.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking of an example from my own life. I have an author friend here in Austin, and we'd been planning to go out and get dinner one night, and it's been really cold here, like 40. This has been hard for me to leave my house. And so I was like, hey, like, how would you feel about coming over to my house and I'll get us takeout? And she was like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Like, I would love to do a house hang. Like, we never do that anymore, and that would be so fun. And I was like, yes, like I can wear my sweatpants and like we can just hang out on the couch and that will be amazing. So it's like, I think like finding the ways that it works for you is really important.
Yeah. No, I love that. So now we're going to do the Ask It Anything question, which is from someone who wants suggestions on how to celebrate achievements when you don't drink. And you also work from home, so no one's going to magically bring you donuts to like the break room or whatever. If you're not a paid subscriber, though, this is where the episode ends. So if you want our ideas on inventive ways of celebrating, head over to culturestudypod.substack.com. Pooja, this has been such a privilege. Seriously, you were on our list, our first list that Melody and I came up with of people that we really wanted to have on the show. And the only reason we didn't ask until recently is because we were accepting your boundary of not doing media appearances.
Thank you.
As you were restoring yourself from your incredible book tour. Where can people find you if they want to hear more from you?
Yes. Well, I am on Substack. I have a newsletter that's called Real Self-Care, and it is at poojalakshmin.substack.com. You can also go to my website and find it there, Pooja Lakshmin, POOJALAKSHMIN. And I'm on Instagram, and yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Anne.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works. I always say that, and it's always true. And I promise you don't want to miss any of them. Now, if you want to suggest a topic or ask a question about the culture that surrounds you or submit a question for our subscriber-only advice time segment, go to our Google form at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod or check the show notes for a link. So we have 2 upcoming episodes, which are for the readers amongst us, which is basically all of you. I mean, really. So one is on historical romance. Super fun. It's going to be amazing. Melody has already fainted twice. We haven't even recorded the episode. And the other one is on fan fiction. The guests for this, like, they are just phenomenal. They are perfect. So let us know what burning questions you have. And if you want to support the show and get bonus content, head to culturestudypod.substack.com. It's just $5 a month or $50 a year, and you'll get ad-free episodes, the exclusive Advice Time segment, which is always super fun, weekly discussion threads for each episode, and a link to a special Google form so that your questions go to the front of the line. And if you're already a Culture Study newsletter subscriber, you get a significant portion off. You can find that in the post for this episode on Substack. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear. You can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson, Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.